Let's get some analysis now with Paul Kelly, Editor-at-Large at The Australian. Paul, if we look back at 2021, once again the pandemic central to everything. A big announcement today, but how do you reflect on the year as it was in terms of the government's performance?
Well, this has been an extraordinary year, Kieran, a traumatic and very punishing year for the Australian public. I think one of the most punishing in Australian history. We saw the Federation fractured. We saw nationhood compromised. We saw the premiers running the response to COVID and a running battle and tension between the premiers and the Prime Minister. Look, the main problem the Prime Minister had this year was that the response to COVID was a public health response, and that is the responsibility of the premiers. So the Prime Minister was in the picture front and centre, but it was the premiers who had the power, and the premiers dictated policies, often very harsh policies of lockdown and border closures, and when things went wrong, they tended to blame the Prime Minister. So Scott Morrison found a lot of his authority being undermined in this battle over COVID and the struggle with the premiers.
And the premiers at times complimenting the opposition, in fact, acting almost like opposition leaders. How would you rate Labor and its position right now as we conclude 2021?
Labor are frontrunners to win the election. The polls for several months now have shown a two-party preferred lead for Labor of about 53-47. The Labor frontbench feels that it's ready to govern. But the fundamental question here, Kieran, is whether the public will trust Labor. You see, there's no great sentiment for change within the Australian community. The people want reassurance and they want security. They don't want radical change. And so what Anthony Albanese's got to do as Labor leader is he's got to persuade them in this mood, this extraordinary national mood, to change horses, to change governments, while recognising that they don't want radical change. Now, this is a difficult ask, and the fundamental question is whether or not people will trust Labor. Labor's lost the last three elections. They've come close in 2016 and in 2019, but coming close is not winning. They can't afford to come close again and lose. That would be devastating for Labor. So Labor's got a lot riding on this. It's got to translate a winning position in the polls to victory on election day. And if it fails, the consequences for Labor are going to be pretty dire.
Oh, absolutely. So many careers, almost a generation of careers spent on the opposition benches, if that's the case. Now, let's look at the variables here. There are so many uncertainties, Paul, as we head into this election season, aren't there, from the variants, COVID, the pandemic, and importantly, how the states will respond.
Well, that's so true, Kieran, and this is what makes the election, which will probably be in the first part of May, still 5 months away, very unpredictable. We know what Scott Morrison's strategy is. He is going to be the champion of the opening up of the Australian economy. He is the champion of a return to normal, of what will be a very strong economic recovery. And this is what Morrison's got going for him. So he wants to negotiate that narrow pathway he has to victory through advancing the economic recovery and arguing that the government is the safe pair of hands. You mightn't like the government, you might recognise all the mistakes the government's made, but what Morrison will say is, at the end of the day, we got the country through the pandemic. We've got a very low death toll, only a bit over 2,000 people have died. We've got a strong economic recovery. We've got a 90% high vaccination rate. So that's going to be his argument. What could upset that? What could upset that is if we find that the latest strand of the virus starts to wreak havoc. That will be a devastating blow for the Prime Minister. And of course, one of the questions here is his ongoing integrity. Scott Morrison's reputation has been damaged in a personal sense. How will that play out in the campaign? Will people remember that, or will they simply vote on results. So as I say, I think it's an election which is highly unpredictable. It will be close, and the risk will be a minority government.
Yep, that is the risk, and so many independents running, which will exacerbate that risk, you would have thought. And finally, uncertainty internationally as well, Paul, isn't there? In a geostrategic sense with China, but even with our close ally, the United States, riven with divides both inside their political parties and outside them.
There's enormous uncertainty globally, Kieran. And what we've seen, of course, in the last 12 months is Scott Morrison taking a very tough line on China, and that's been successful. Australia has not buckled to the economic coercion of China, and that's a significant victory for Australia. And I'd make the point that the tough line on China was bipartisan. That is, that Anthony Albanese was most anxious to ensure that there was no substantial strategic difference, no national security difference between the government and Labor. That was critical. There are doubts about the United States. America is undergoing domestic traumas, and there's no doubt the position of both Scott Morrison and Labor is to deepen the alliance with the United States. We think this is fundamental, given the rise of China, the more assertive attitude that China has. But one of the fundamental question marks about the entire Australian strategy is how reliable is the United States under Trump before and now under Biden? To what extent does America's domestic trauma mean that it's going to be less reliable in terms of taking a strong leadership role in the world? And is it actually prepared to use its military power?